Hi, my name's Torsten Moritz. I'm a university professor, I'm an author, I'm a speaker. I know the church scene quite well, the university scene, of course, seminaries, and so on. I'm also someone who's really interested in what's happening at the moment in this country. What happened 2 days ago in the Capitol building, the insurrection I'm talking about in Washington, was instigated by the president, who in turn was supported to a significant extent by Christians in this country. Now, as people are interested in faith, Jesus, church, we probably should have asked who the heck are we long before this. But certainly now we need to ask it, who are we as churches, as Christians? And you might think of this denomination, that denomination, you might represent this strand of thinking or that idea. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean more quintessentially, who are we and who are we supposed to be in this world? And how do we decide that? Somebody might say, well, I was raised this way. I had a professor who told me this and I liked him or her. I read a book somewhere or I saw a TV preacher or whatever. None of those things are good enough. We need better reasons to figure out who we are. One way of trying to figure that out is to ask the world, if you will, and say, hey, who do you think we are? And the world might say, you look like the corporate world at prayer. And we go, is that all we want to be? Is that our reason for being in this world? Another way of looking at this, of course, would be to say, what does Jesus have to do with all of this? I mean, after all, this is how the story started, right? So what does he have to do with it? We could go back through the New Testament and we can ask Jesus, who are we supposed to be in this world? What are you about? Why did you tell us you're going to end up dying? Well, you said you're going to do that because you want to give the world essentially a chance at renewal. What exactly is our place in all that? What exactly does that mean for how we think of ourselves as church, churches, denominations, whatever you want to call it? And where do we go from here, especially in these current times? Now, I'm not in the business of giving cheap answers to that or quick answers or anything like that, but I do want to lay some foundations. And one of those foundations is to ask, what exactly did Jesus claim to be doing for this world? And what does this mean for what the church is supposed to do for the world? Your church, my church, anybody's church. What's our reason for being in this world? We're supposed to be here as essentially good news for the world. We're supposed to somehow take what Jesus achieved 2,000 years ago and make that more accessible to this world, a world that is hurting and so on, and that needs good news. We're supposed to be that, not just to talk about it, blah, blah, blah. Not just to check doctrines. Who cares about doctrines? Doctrines have never transformed anyone. Doctrines may be right, they may be wrong, who cares? No, in Prohibition Theology, this channel here, I'm not going to ask about doctrines. I'm going to ask, what are the actual foundations of who we're supposed to be? Why did we abandon the origin story of Christianity so quickly and so comprehensively, and where do we go now? What did we choose instead, and why? So please join me in this journey. We don't have to agree. Disagreement is fine. But I do want to say one thing about disagreement, which I really enjoy. Disagreement is great, because that's how we learn. However, disagreement needs to be founded on some kind of reason. And you know, we live in a time where people say, I researched this and this is how it is. And what they mean by that is they checked out Wikipedia, they watched 2 YouTube videos. That's obviously not good enough. Neither is the idea that a person thinks, well, there are a lot of people who agree with me, therefore I'm right. Well, there are probably more people who disagree with you. So sometimes people come to me and they say, well, this is an interesting view that you've got. However, I know so many people who are experts in the field like you are, and they disagree with you. Well, I know a lot of experts who agree with me. We're not getting anywhere if that's how we're going to approach it. By all means, please disagree with me, but disagree with me on the basis of actual reasons. Okay, so remember how I said in the other video that your church is a synagogue? Well, I'll get to that. First, I want to do something else. I want to tell you a little bit of my story. And I was asked, I was a professor in England, and I was asked by a school here in the Twin Cities area in Minnesota to come and join their faculty. And I ended up doing it. Now, I was in an unusual situation. They came to me. I had never heard of them before. I ended up coming, but I was not looking for a job, so I had a certain freedom. I did accept the invitation and I came, and then you're supposed to do an introductory lecture, you know, like an inaugural lecture in front of the seminary community, your colleagues and whatnot. So I did. And my title was, and here it is, I dug it out this morning, my title was No temple, no cry. You know the Bob Marley song, No Woman, No Cry? It's kind of a bit of a play on that. But anyway, it was about early Christianity, and it was about the fact that clearly what Jesus did and what the first Christians did in the first century and what we're doing today and what we have done for hundreds of years really bear no resemblance at all. Think about it. You go into a seminary, you're appointed as professor, and your inaugural lecture is this. But hey, I wasn't looking for the job, so I felt free. And you know what? I needed people to know what I'm about, what I stand for, and I needed to make sure I had the freedom to teach what I needed to teach. And if I'm a New Testament professor, which I was appointed as, I need to be free to teach New Testament stuff without regard for, institutional politics and so on. Ask me sometime how all that shaped up, over the years. Anyway, I was there for what? 13 years, I think. And you might ask yourself, well, with a title like this, No Temple, No Cry, and, with someone who says things like churches are synagogues, not churches, how do you last in a seminary that long? It's very simple. Seminaries are about income, and my student evaluations were great. And I'm grateful to the students, but that's the only thing that really kept me in that job. So anyway, I did it for a bunch of years, and it was great. Here we go. No Temple, No Cry. I wanted to introduce you to this. I'm just going to read 5 lines to you, okay? Within little more than a decade after the death of Jesus, Paul was merrily engaged in setting up fairly self-sufficient communities as local manifestations of God's people. The degree to which early Christianity was able to leave behind the hierarchical centralization inherent in biblical Judaism, Old Testament Judaism essentially, is truly astounding. It is only surpassed, to my mind, by 2 other astonishing aspects. One, the speed with which the 2nd century, so Jesus was in the 1st century, now I'm talking about the 2nd century, the speed with which 2nd century Christianity up to this day reverted to the old ways before Jesus, and secondly, the fact that there is surprisingly little scholarly interest in this. You can go to seminaries up and down the country, any denomination you like, and you will find very little on this. It's truly astonishing. Would never happen in med school. In med school, if there's a medical tradition that really impacts what you're doing now, you better talk about it. In theology, no, you get away with all sorts of stuff. So anyway, that's how I started. And I don't know what my colleagues at the time, what they thought about this. Perhaps not surprisingly, there wasn't a lot of conversation around this afterwards. Sometimes people feel awkward when you say something that they're not used to. And in any case, I'm not going to go in there now. But basically, what I did in that inaugural lecture was I had a bunch of theses, and I'm going to read those to you. And they will give you a bit of an introduction as to why I provocatively stated in the last video that your church is actually a synagogue. Okay? So here we go. I'll just take you through it. And then in part 3, I'm going to give more specific, I'm essentially going to ask you to think of your church and to compare it with what the Old Testament was talking about in terms of how Israel, organized itself. And I want to ask you whether your church has more in common with that or more in common with Jesus, what Jesus did in the 1st century. Okay, so we'll get to that. But in the meantime, here are the theses. There's 6 of them, and then a couple of other comments, actually 4 other comments. But it's really quick. All right, thesis number 1. Israel, this is what I presented to the faculty at the time. And by the way, it's not like anyone ever came up and said, hi, I disagree with you. Well, people say they disagree with me, but it's not like anyone has ever actually challenged the content of this. People voice their disagreement, but to this day, I'm not aware of my colleagues ever having come up and said, here is why you are wrong. No, you just don't talk about it. And that's why this channel is called Prohibition Theology, because this is a little bit like a speakeasy. We do talk about it. Okay, so here goes. Thesis 1. Israel's biblical faith, so the faith of the Old Testament that's, expounded in the Old Testament, is essentially and deliberately centripetal or centralistic. So it's about Israel's faith is all about a center. You know, Israel is the center of the world. Jerusalem is the center of Israel. The temple is the center of Jerusalem. And then the Holy of Holies is the center inside the temple. Everything is very concentric. So that's the directionality of Israel's faith according to the Old Testament. Thesis number 2, Second Temple Judaism. You may or may not know that there were 2 temples built in the Old Testament because stuff happened and it had to be rebuilt. And the period from the second one until Jesus, more or less a little later, until AD 70, when that one was destroyed, is called Second Temple Judaism. So here's thesis 2. Second Temple Judaism actively devised ways of strengthening the centralization of the Old Testament. Thesis 3. Jesus redefined God's people. Redefined, okay, he did not reinforce what was there, he redefined what was there. He moved away from what was there. Jesus redefined God's people in Christocentric terms. That means he becomes the new center rather than a temple, okay? And that church, or that understanding of church, is actually an understanding of churches, plural, because he's not interested in creating a denomination or anything like that. All that happened later. His notion of churches is decidedly centrifugal. In other words, it's moving outwards. It's the opposite of what we had before. This is crucial for what Jesus came to achieve in terms of essentially a sort of a chance for humanity to experience renewal. Okay, so the temple is no longer needed. It's as simple as that. Jesus is not interested in another temple. Thesis 4, the early church. So these are the first Christians right around Jesus, right after Jesus. The early church, and above all, Paul, you know, the apostle who wrote a bunch of letters in the New Testament, after some initial problems of adjustment, embraced this no temple notion of kingship. Remember, my inaugural lecture was called No Temple, No Cry. So the early church, and above all, Paul, embraced this no temple notion of kingship. Kingship means how God impacts this world for the good. And Paul was very clear that that does not involve a temple anymore. Now, he embraced that, and others embraced it eventually, but he was one of the early ones. He was an early adopter. Now, they embraced this not for pragmatic reasons. They embraced it for theological reasons because they understood that what Jesus was doing went to the very heart of bringing about that change from centralistic to the very opposite. Okay, thesis 5. From the 2nd century onwards, Christianity reverted to synagogue mode, and this is essentially still true today. I will demonstrate that to you in the 3rd part. Okay, so that's the 5th. So I'm basically saying until Jesus comes along, you have this highly centralistic thing with a temple, and people go on pilgrimages, and there are special offices, you know, priests, and they're considered holier than, you know, there are different degrees of holiness and whatnot. And everything is pointing to the center. So the festivals, the food regulations, and lots of other stuff. There are particular regulations how you're supposed to live a quote-unquote holy life, and so on. Completely centralized. Jesus comes along and he blows that out of the water. Does that get talked about in seminaries? Sometimes, maybe a little bit. Does it make much of an impact on people? Not really. Why not? Because seminaries are supposed to produce people, apparently, who end up working in centralized settings. Okay, so in some ways, a lot of this stuff gets swept under the carpet. So my point here in the 5th thesis is that whereas Jesus decentralized what came before and basically said this is like a restart, the New Testament uses language like recreation. So a lot of things that Jesus says are phrased in language that recall creation language from the beginning of the Old Testament. And there's a reason for that. Now, Paul and others understood the theological reasons, and so they were on board in going along with the decentralization that Jesus stood for. But this thesis 5 here is basically saying from the 2nd century onwards, people essentially said, listen, Jesus, great that you perform that sacrifice on the cross, but your idea of church and decentralization, no, we're not going to do that. We're actually going to go back. We're going to conceive of Christianity as it emerges in the empire, in the Roman Empire. We're going to conceive of it in a way that mirrors what we had before you came and did your thing, okay? By the way, just in case you're wondering, how do people get away with this today? This kind of attitude or this approach that says, hey, Jesus, we're actually going to do it like it used to be before you. Simple. You talk about Jesus not in terms of what Jesus means for the world, what Jesus means in terms of a renewal of humanity. No, you talk about Jesus only in the sense of what Jesus means for the individual person in terms of salvation. You talk about what Jesus means for the indefinite future. You talk about heaven as if it were this distant thing that has nothing to do with here. That's how you do it. And suddenly you are free to ignore the stuff that he actually did and said. Number 6. The theological gulf between today, which I call synagogal Christianity, and early Christianity in the first century is such that most Christians today would find early Christianity a disturbingly loose network of sectarians. While Jesus and the first Christians, if they were able to time travel into our time, they would walk into our churches and say, these are synagogues. All right, 4 comments about all this. Number 1, it is frequently suggested by theologians that Christianity based itself on synagogal patterns. Now, I will show you in the third part that synagogues were centralistic like the temple. I'll say more about that a bit later. But it is often suggested that early Christianity based itself on that model, but that's not actually true. That turns the evidence on its head. Early Christianity, in the sense of the first century, in the sense of Jesus, in the sense of the first Christians, in the sense of the New Testament, early Christianity was precisely not synagogal. It was precisely an alternative to the synagogue, one that took the centralization from the synagogue and turned it outside, upside down, inward out, whatever you want to call it. So it completely beats me how in a seminary context, and I cannot tell you how many times I've heard this, in a seminary context, people will say, oh well, the first Christians, they modeled what they were doing on the synagogue, and therefore what we're doing today, it may look synagogal, but it's totally fine because that's what they did. Excuse me? There's no historical warrant for that whatsoever. Does that get talked about? Not to my knowledge. Second comment, quite important. Synagogal is not a negative thing. I'm not using that as a negative term or as a term for something negative. I'm just saying synagogal, the synagogues, it's the adjective of the word synagogue, Jewish places of worship. Well, it represents the temple. It represents the kind of spirituality that Israel went for according to the Old Testament. It represents that. And that creates a very different agenda for the role of believers in this world than what Jesus did. I'm not saying that is itself bad. I'm just saying it's really different, and we better know about this. So how many times have you talked about this in your church? What would your pastor say if you asked your pastor, hey, are we more of a synagogue or are we more of a Jesus-type crowd? Who are we? My third comment is that I'm pretty sure that most Christians have no idea that their churches resemble synagogues, much closer than they resemble what Jesus was about. I'm pretty sure that there are hardly any pastors who know about this. I've taught in seminary for years. I've had thousands of students, thousands of pastors among those students. To my knowledge, based on my experience of talking about this stuff in the classroom, people are completely flabbergasted by it. Okay, my last comment on this. So Jesus is very explicit, as is the rest of the New Testament. You just read something like, Ephesians 2, for instance. Jesus is very explicit about the fact that what he is about is to renew humanity, essentially to say to the world, listen, world, there's a way of being human that is better than what you're currently experiencing. Let's call it renewal, and that's what I am about. And so he is quite radical that way, and of course it got him into trouble. Now, Christians today, by and large, are not radical and they never get into trouble. And I'm not suggesting anyone should get into trouble just for the heck of it. But the reason nobody ever gets into trouble is, of course, because churches have assimilated to the world rather than being a hope for the world, a hope of renewal. And I do wonder if Jesus did walk into churches today, how despairing he would actually be, seeing that this really is corporate America or corporate whatever at prayer. Can we do better than that? So in the third part, I'm going to show you why I said and why I keep saying your church is a synagogue.